Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. I'm Maryanne Spurdle, the research manager here, and we are here today with Amanda Achtman. She's from Calgary in Canada. She previously worked as a senior advisor to a Canadian MP working to prevent the expansion of euthanasia to those living with a disability or mental illness. She holds graduate degrees from universities in Italy and Poland. Amanda currently works with Canadian Physicians for Life, teaches bioethics, and writes for Public Discourse. And she also has her own project of cultural renewal called Dying to Meet You. It includes video interviews featuring personal stories, and she speaks around the world on topics of suffering, death, meaning, and hope, which is why she's in New Zealand. And we are also having a conversation with Amanda about euthanasia legislation generally, and the effects of that in Canada and New Zealand. But today, what we're going to be speaking about, because at the time of recording, we've just learned that there is a members' bill that will be suggesting some significant changes to the euthanasia law here in New Zealand. It had been in the tin to remove the 6-month prognosis requirement if it was to be accepted. And now I haven't seen the full text of the legislation, but from a press release, it looks like it will also be including 25 recommendations from the Ministry of Health that it released last November. We'll touch on some of those, but it looks like more and more the legislation in New Zealand is aligning itself with Canada. You're an expert on how that's gone in Canada, so it'll be good to hear some of your thoughts from the perspective of somebody who's seen this in action.
Yes, Canada has become the euthanasia capital of the entire world. And in 2016, euthanasia was legalized nationwide and then further expanded in 2021. It started out as exceptional with supposed safeguards that fewer than 5 years later have been eroded. And euthanasia has really gone from being exceptional to routine, to the extent that far from being an extenuating circumstance alone that may drive a euthanasia request, for many this is becoming seen as the ideal way to die. And so this massive cultural shift is a warning to other countries, especially countries that would look to Canada, whereas other jurisdictions maybe saying, we won't be anything like Canada, this is how we would do it differently. It's very notable, as you mentioned, that New Zealand is looking to Canada, given that Canada has become the most expansionist jurisdiction quickly with euthanasia.
Yeah, I understand about 5% of deaths in Canada are now by euthanasia.
That's right.
And in some areas, it's even higher than that, higher than the average, obviously. Getting into some of the specifics, because some people might think that that's not, if 1 in 20 want to go that way, why not? But speaking to some of the specifics of this members' bill, if it does pass, and for those who need to know how the system works, the members' bills are drawn randomly. So it may get picked up in the next few weeks. It could be a year. It could never get drawn. There is a provision whereby if they get enough support from parliamentarians, I think if 60 agree to back it, then it doesn't need to wait to be drawn. And a campaign has begun now to get the kind of support that it needs to be acted on sooner rather than later. The first thing that it would suggest to do, which the original bill had, was removing the 6-month prognosis. And the argument is that this is an equity issue. There are people who have longer than 6 months to live who are suffering just as much as somebody who's facing the very end of their life. So why shouldn't somebody with a degenerative condition also have access to it? Canada made that exact change a few years ago. What have you witnessed before and after that change as it impacts different segments of society?
This shows really why euthanasia cannot remain limited once legalized. Once it's accepted as a reasonable or compassionate means to alleviate suffering, why would you eliminate it? Of course, there are people who are suffering physically, but there are also people who are suffering mentally. Of course, there are adults suffering, but there are children suffering with all kinds of conditions as well. And so we do see the euthanasia proponents in Canada arguing for euthanasia for children, as they refer to them as mature minors, 12 and up. Also, it's been recommended that euthanasia be expanded to infants, and that was a recommendation by the head of the Quebec College of Physicians and Surgeons. And so
what's his rationale for that? How does he get around the whole autonomy and so
he
forth?
actually speaks about the suffering of the parents, not even about the suffering of the child. And I think that's very revealing, because so often it is about the suffering of the bystanders, of the friends, family, of others, rather than the person, him or herself, who's not really the center of concern, but rather the expediency or the impatience of others. And so euthanasia was expanded on the basis of disability, and that's it. That once euthanasia is legalized, it will be expanded on the grounds of equality. And once it's seen as tantamount to a right, it will become expanded to more and more people as a matter of eligibility. But the sinister thing is, once more and more people are told that they qualify for a premature end to their life by a lethal injection by a doctor or nurse, that sends a social message that there are categories of people who could just not exist. And it creates a two-tier society where some people get suicide assistance and others get suicide prevention. And that's what we're really hearing, especially from the disability community, that why am I offered MAID, medical aid in dying, rather than the support I need to live? I've even heard from people with disabilities who say, MAID is the only thing, medical aid in dying is the only thing the government has told me I'm eligible for these days.
Yeah. It's really telling when disability advocates are some of the strongest opponents of this. Your point about this is about removing suffering for observers as much as anything is proven by that. People who are in conditions that others think, well, I would be suffering too much if I was in a wheelchair or couldn't do this or that. They're projecting that on this other person who themselves thinks life is worth living in a wheelchair.
Exactly.
But people don't like to face suffering.
And on the point of a 6-month prognosis, a UK story highlighted that those are wrong at least half of the time. Doctors get that 6-month prognosis wrong. And so it's already a kind of superficial boundary. And isn't it ironic that those who are proposing expanding euthanasia are doing so saying that death doesn't always have a calendar, all the while promoting scheduling death on a certain date? This conceit that we can have mastery over the timing of death saps so much of the mystery. As a friend of mine puts it, birth has a mystery to it. Death, too, has mystery to it. And if we shatter that, we actually do damage to ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Elevating convenience over something that actually is a mystery. Another change that this bill would bring about, if it gets passed, is removing the need to consent on the day of death. This isn't quite, from what I understand, an actual advanced medical directive where you say at a certain point, I would like to be euthanized if I lose the mental capacity. But it does raise some concerns. I remember hearing about a woman in the Netherlands who had dementia, and I don't know how often this happens, but this one made news because she had to be held down by family and medical staff to receive a lethal injection. She thought that she wanted death once she reached a certain point, but on the day, she didn't. How is this navigated in Canada, this idea of not having to consent on the day?
Similarly, in Canada, we had what's called a waiver of final consent, which removes the requirement for contemporaneous consent at the moment of death. And as the Member of Parliament with whom I was working at the time stood up and said in the House of Commons, you need contemporaneous consent for sex. Why not for death, which is so much more serious? And so to remove that requirement for contemporaneous consent was the removal of a safeguard that had been deemed essential just some years prior. And so we created an initiative called No Same Day Death, because to have death on the same day that you request it, that's one aspect of the law. But this other was this waiver of final consent that could mean that if you lose capacity within a certain window, your former will will bind your future self so irrevocably that you will be killed, as that woman was who you described. And so it really does shatter freedom. It says there's a point at which you are no longer free because you have bound yourself in this way. We don't accept it in other domains. We should not accept it around death.
So in Canada, there are people who are putting this in place for themselves and receiving euthanasia without consenting on the day. Who makes the decision then?
So the person could be deemed eligible to have their life ended.
And consent then.
And then their condition may deteriorate such that they are said to lose capacity. And in the judgment of the medical professionals, that loss of capacity would be recognized as having not interfered with the consent that they gave previously, allowing the euthanasia to go forward.
So in Canada, somebody decides that I'm probably going to lose capacity. How does this work?
Then there would be a 10-day period where when that person requests euthanasia, anticipating that they're going to lose consent within that window, they could be approved, and then their request for euthanasia would be enacted based on their prior consent.
With or without them consenting on the day.
Right.
Yeah. This version of the bill would also include 25 recommendations that the Ministry of Health made in its review last November. One would allow physicians to raise the idea of euthanasia unsolicited with their patients, as I believe they do in Canada. What have you heard from patients in Canada who've experienced this, going to the doctor for healthcare and getting the message you could qualify?
The fact of having euthanasia suggested already, in a certain sense, kills the person. It deflates a person's sense of self-worth. It sends a message that you could just not be here anymore. And when a doctor or nurse, a person in a position of authority, says to a person in their vulnerability that they qualify to have their life ended, that is tantamount to a suggestion, to a medical recommendation. And so many people are facing the kind of pressure that comes from the moral authority and the professional judgment of the doctor or nurse who's raising it. I think that's something to be very, very sensitive to, that a doctor or nurse cannot mention something among a suite of treatment options that doesn't have weight to the patient. And euthanasia is not really a treatment option, but it's becoming offered as one. But it's so unreasonable to suggest to a patient suicide, an assisted suicide, rather than care. And I think that is basically a form of coercion.
Right. From the Ministry of Health's review, it frames it as a consumer rights issue. If this is now a legitimate option healthcare-wise, the consumer has the right to know what their options are. Therefore, there's no further consideration of the impact on patients. One of the stories that stood out to me in Catherine Mannix's excellent book called With the End in Mind, she treated one patient in the UK who originally had been in the Netherlands. He had a terminal diagnosis. Turned out he had, I think, just a couple months to live. But on the ward where he was in the Netherlands, he was repeatedly offered euthanasia. He felt like a coward for not taking the option. He assumed that because they were so insistent that he think about it, what he was facing must be worse than death. And he really felt ashamed that he was putting his wife and young daughter through watching him go through something that he was convinced would be terrible. He literally ran away from the Netherlands. I think he had family in the UK, was treated by Catherine Mannix there. And she talked about the peace he found being in a place where that was no longer on the table. And I think this is missing from the discussion that the Ministry of Health here has, and that is there are actually negative impacts on patients who don't want to be offered dying as an option. This man died peacefully. He slipped into unconsciousness. His wife was in the room with him. His daughter was playing outside, and he was free of the burden of having to make that decision that he did not feel comfortable making. So none of the fears that were placed on him by that constant suggestion ever eventuated. And it just strikes me that this need to get physicians to offer it to patients seems geared to normalize it. Everybody knows that it's legal here, and I assume in Canada as well. There's been enough discussion over the years that they could raise it if they wanted. Have you heard any kind of valid arguments for raising it, or do you think people know about it? They should be able to bring it up.
I think people do know about it, and I think that when it lacks patient initiation, there is an element of coercion. What I hear consistently from many elderly people and people with disabilities, and generally people who may have any reason to visit a hospital, is I want the right to a maid-free space, because all places are becoming sites of euthanasia. And among the proponents of euthanasia, the argument is nobody should be forced to be transferred from one place to another to have their life ended. And so it must be available on site absolutely everywhere. And so even with a Catholic hospital called St. Paul's, there's a lawsuit launched by the euthanasia lobby group Dying with Dignity because this hospital does not provide euthanasia on site. And they've built a corridor through which patients can be wheeled next door to be killed in the adjacent building, so that it's not technically on site of the Catholic hospital. But this is the lengths to which the proponents of euthanasia are going to insist that it be absolutely ubiquitous, provided and available everywhere, because once euthanasia becomes seen as a good or a right, then it becomes an access problem not to have it. But the tension is, if you see it not as a right and a good, but as an evil and a harm because it is killing a person, then it becomes threatening. It becomes fearful and a risk to you, especially when you go into a place seeking healthcare and then realizing that you could be treated by someone who just in the next door over had just ended their patient's life. Who can trust their doctor in this context?
On the topic of access in care homes, this is another element of the bill that's being introduced. Again, pulling from the Ministry of Health's own recommendations, which say that all care homes, all hospices, rest homes would be required to allow it on site, again, for access purposes. And this was the bit that astounded me, or they risk losing their registration, which I thought, we don't have enough hospices, we don't have enough care homes, and that's only going to get worse with the aging population. What rationale could there possibly be to try to eliminate them from the system if they don't allow it on site? How hard is it to just take somebody elsewhere, which people often end up doing at the end of life in ambulances and other things, not what they had in mind, but like you said, there's the right of others to have euthanasia-free spaces. In Canada, how are care homes, care facilities, hospices navigating that requirement?
Yes, this goes to show how ideological and militant the euthanasia proponents are in making sure that euthanasia is everywhere. And what we see in Canada is that there was a hospice called Delta Hospice that was shut down because it was not going to provide euthanasia on site.
Just for that one reason.
That's it. And so basically taken over. They had fundraised, they had built this hospice and wanted to live out the values of hospice and palliative care, and the government quashed it, all because they would not provide euthanasia on site. There was also a story in BC. All of these stories seem to be in British Columbia that I'm sharing right now, but also in British Columbia, there was a euthanasia doctor who snuck into a Jewish retirement center and euthanized a patient on site before that was really allowed. And
this was somebody who'd requested it, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet it sent a chill throughout this entire retirement residence with people saying there are Holocaust survivors here, and we are having this chilling experience of having someone come into our home. And that's what the proponents are saying. Well, we have to have access to people's home. But when you send people to homes for people with disabilities, to retirement homes, it cannot but reverberate throughout the community, and people know that their neighbors have been killed. I have a friend of mine, an elderly woman who I went to visit at a retirement home, and she said, my neighbor told me that her neighbor had went to get the needle. That's how they're talking about it among themselves. Yeah. The seniors are just saying, oh, she went to get the needle. Yeah. That's chilling. And that sends shockwaves through homes for the elderly.
Yeah. There's one hospice in New Zealand that opted to allow it on site, and only one so far. And when it made that decision, they lost their charge nurse and over a dozen staff because those people did not sign up to be in a place where people were being actively killed. I can only imagine the impact on health workers, let alone the availability of hospice care, if they do go ahead and try to do this. It will mean that a lot of people who found their careers caring for people at the end of life won't have anywhere where they can work without feeling like they're complicit in euthanasia. And finally, another of the many things that this bill would introduce is actually something that would limit conscientious objection rights for healthcare workers, which I think is another important area. The ministry's take seems to be, and it looks like this bill's take will be, as long as you're not the one administering the drug, then you don't have any conscientious objection rights. You should be able to participate in the process up until that point. So referrals, any medical records needed, you need to help somebody get, if you're not offering it yourself, you need to help them find somebody who will. At the moment, the way it stands is all the doctor has to do is say, I'm a conscientious objector. There's a phone number. Within the health system, there is a service that will match people up with doctors who provide it. And so at the moment, all they have to do is let them know that there are other people who can refer you. But again, it's seen as an access issue. What have you seen in Canada with health professionals who are being put into, those who have conscientious objection to participating? How are they navigating it, or are they leaving?
The way that Canada legalized euthanasia was by creating an exception to the criminal code offense of homicide, so that doctors or nurses are basically not culpable for homicide if they're following the rules around medical aid in dying. And it's underneath that explanation where there's a brief note that no medical practitioner will be compelled or obligated to participate in medical assistance in dying. However, similarly, the interpretation of that has been that medical professionals would still have to make an effective referral. Mm-hmm. And doctors who oppose to killing their patients generally don't want to refer them either to have someone else do that. And so it is an erosion of conscience rights to mandate referrals, and it also defies a doctor's professional judgment. Yeah. And that's really a way of wounding healthcare professionals in their sense of dignity and pride that they deserve to take in what is known to be as a healing profession. And so that erosion of conscience rights is happening in that way, in a big way, and also with professional conformity. I've heard from palliative care doctors in Canada who say that their med students have seen a made death, but they haven't seen a natural death. What is that when medical students are having more exposure to euthanasia than they are to natural dying and death? And when that becomes your whole impression of what it is to die, how distorting that is of the nature of the profession itself, and that doctors who might feel at a loss when they have nothing left to solve or nothing left to cure, the solution is not to end the patient's life, but to provide all the care, palliative care, psychosocial support, to help that person live well until they die. As the founder of hospice, Cicely Saunders, said, you matter because you're you, and you matter until the last moment of your life. So our job is to help you live well until you die. And it's so important that we have pluralism in terms of healthcare practitioners and institutions in order to drive home the contrast. Once we see the universalizing, totalizing domination of euthanasia within the society, people cannot see the juxtaposition. But everybody deserves to see the contrast between life-affirming care, where the person is the center of the concern and where they are receiving love and care, and the euthanasia proposal that ends a life on a scheduled deadline around the patient, around the family members, or around the doctor's schedule. These are diverging approaches, and people deserve to see them in full contrast. And then I think people will see clearly, the more that we have the contrast available on offer, this is what I want for me and my loved ones, the love and care, not the premature end to this loved one's life.
Yeah. And I think the fact that palliative care isn't universally available, hospices are not fully funded. They rely a lot on charity, and even so, it's not guaranteed they can keep their doors open. That kind of comes to the will in the political system to provide the best death and not just the most expedient death. I really liked what you quoted Cicely Saunders saying. Could you just repeat that quote for us to end on? Because sure. I really love that.
Yeah, so Cicely Saunders, the founder of the modern hospice and palliative care movement, she said, "You matter because you're you, and you matter until the last moment of your life. And so we're going to help you live well until you die."
Thank you.
You're welcome.